Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our quarterly virtual estate planning webinar. We are delighted to have so many of you joining us today. My name is Kara McDonald. I'm the Director of Philanthropy and Plan Giving at the Seattle Public Library Foundation. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Cindy Sherrick, the Director of Donor Relations at the King County Library System Foundation. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that our libraries are on Indigenous land. These are the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. The United States government promised hunting and fishing rights and a reservation to the Duwamish people in exchange for more than 54,000 acres of their homeland in the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. In the 166 years that have passed, the government's promises were never honored. We acknowledge that we continue to occupy Duwamish land.
Thank you, Kara. I'm going to run through a few items of note for today's webinar. First of all, you'll notice that you're muted and your cameras are off other than our panelists to limit background noise and distraction. We're recording today's presentation and we'll send a link to the recording as well as some supplemental materials after we wrap up. At the end of today's presentation, we'll have time for Q&A and we will pose those questions on your behalf. To ask a question at any point, please use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen, or it actually might be at the top if you're using an iPhone or an iPad. We'll get to as many questions as we can during the live Q&A at the end. You'll also see a chat function, which our staff will moderate. So if you run into any technical difficulties, use the chat feature to get assistance. Finally, when you sign off today, you'll be prompted to take a quick survey about your experience. Please take a few minutes to complete this. It's so important to how we shape our future events, so we need your input. And to sweeten the deal for you book nerds, everyone who completes the survey will be entered into a drawing to win one of two prizes, book bags. If there are any questions that you have that don't get answered during today's session, you'll find contact information at the end of the presentation. And of course, we're happy to connect with you one-on-one after this to answer additional questions you might have.
I'm going to tell everyone a little bit about our foundations now, but I'm going to keep it super short so we can get into this great presentation. And I think if you come away with anything today from Cindy and me, we just want you to know that both of our foundations support library programs beyond what public funding alone supports. And since this is a plan giving seminar, it's worth noting that some of our most generous and transformational gifts to our organizations have come in the form of bequests. Foundation funding was especially important over the past year and a half when our libraries were closed. Foundation dollars allowed our libraries to regroup and come up with new ways to serve the public from a safe distance. And now that they're mostly open again, we're all really excited.
Our topic today is different from our usual webinars, and it's an important topic for both of our organizations. It's actually central to our missions and our commitment to the community. We're eager for you to learn how to incorporate a legacy of social justice while supporting the organizations you love, like our libraries. Today's speakers have extensive knowledge on this topic, and I am thrilled and honored to introduce them today. Lorraine Del Prado is the principal of Del Prado Philanthropy and vice president of Thompson and Associates. She specializes in values-based estate planning consulting and philanthropic planning, and is a frequent speaker on topics related to philanthropy and purposeful estate plans. Lorraine has been in the field of charitable planning for more than 27 years. Elena Pullen-Venema has been with the Community Foundation of Snohomish County since 2013. As Director of Gift Planning, she worked closely with families and individuals and their accountants, attorneys, and financial advisors to help build tax-friendly charitable giving options that create meaningful legacies and grow philanthropy throughout Snohomish County. She has more than 20 years of experience in this nonprofit sector. So with that, I will let them take it away. Elena and Lorraine.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us today for this presentation on estate planning and plan giving with a social and racial justice framework, an invitation and the start of a conversation. Many of you are probably wondering, what does estate planning have to do with racial justice and social justice? Well, estate planning is more than just a set of documents. It is an expression of your values. It is the result of your personal reflections on your life and legacy. It involves your relationships with family and society and how you are going to harness your assets to benefit your family and your community. And all of these could incorporate the quest for greater social and racial justice. Estate planning also enables the transfer of assets inequitably owned from one generation to the next. We've all heard the statistics about anywhere between 30 to 70 trillion dollars that will be transferred in the next 50 years. And given our understanding of the racial wealth gap, estate planning is an unintentional facilitator and perpetuator of the wealth divide among whites and marginalized people of color. How should you then approach estate planning after recognizing this fact? While the top 1% of wealth holders should definitely have the biggest responsibility in this reckoning, we all can take part in really helping heal this wound through our estate plans. Now, Elena and I do not pretend to be specialists in this topic, far from it. We are simply synthesizing and applying ideas that we've learned in our own personal journey with regard to racial and social justice on our professional fields of values-based estate planning and plan giving. So in this presentation, we will be sharing with you various ideas and suggestions for you to consider. And we will also be sharing an outline of these concepts and suggestions, as well as the sources and inspiration, an extensive reading list with you. At the end of the webinar, there will be a handout that will be shared with you via email. All right, so our agenda today, first we will be defining our terms. What do we mean by social and racial justice, caste and equity? And then we'll take a look at how a social and racial justice lens can be incorporated in your pre-estate planning reflections and documents that communicate your values and your vision for your wealth, and how you create a values-based estate distribution plan, and also how you choose the charities that will be benefiting from your estate giving. And then we'll also talk about how you can incorporate this social and racial justice lens in how your investments are managed, and also in how you engage estate planning professionals. So we hope that you've had a chance to review at least one of the two handouts that were shared with you yesterday on the origins and the systems that contribute to the racial wealth gap, because these really provide an important context for this conversation. So now we'll start with Elena helping us with the definition of terms.
Great, thanks so much, Lorraine. So as I'm sure we're all familiar with, there are several definitions of social and racial justice out there, and they have a lot in common with one another. For the purposes of our talk today, we choose definition proposed in Maurianne Adams and Leanne Bell's book, Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. As you can see here in the slide, the goal of social justice is, quote, full and equitable. So not equal, equitable. That's a key term that we're going to be using over and over again today. Equitable participation of people from all social identity groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. Its vision is a world where the distribution of resources is equitable, again, equitable, and ecologically sustainable, and all members are physically and psychologically safe and secure and recognized and treated with respect. So this definition really expands or broadens what we mean by justice to include, first of all, being respectful of and accountable to all, having shared resources and making sure they're available for succeeding generations, sharing power and agency, and shunning all forms of oppression that cause psychological, economic, and physical harm, including death. So when we talk about social justice, we also brings attention to the important difference, as I mentioned just briefly in the previous slide, between equality, equity, and justice. So I'm sure many of you have seen different versions of this graphic of different people trying to see over a fence into a baseball game. This is one that Lorraine and I like in particular for a number of reasons. One reason is that if you look at the ground that the people are standing on, that it's the uneven ground That meaning that the inequality, inequity, and injustice that we see demonstrated in these pictures is not based on any shortcomings from the individuals involved, but really based on the systemic nature of where everyone, in this case, in our country, starts from in terms of access to equality, equity, and justice. So digging a little bit deeper into this graphic, we look at equality, the equality graphic. Equality means treating everyone equally regardless of their individual situations or needs. Moving forward, the equity piece. Equity goes a step further by providing various levels of support tailored to different people's needs in order to achieve greater fairness in outcomes. So basically providing everyone with what he or she or they specifically needs to succeed. So, and again, in this graphic, the difference between equality and equity: equality, everyone getting the same size box to stand on; equity being everyone getting the size of the box that they need to see over the fence, depending on where they are based in that uneven ground. Another reason Lorraine and I really like this graphic as opposed to some of the other graphics having to do with the equality, equity definitions is because it adds that third frame of justice. And so it's one thing for people to be treated equitably, but it's another, the next logical step is, okay, we need to seek for justice. We need to seek for social and racial justice. Justice refers to removing the barriers that prevent equality and equity. And so basically knocking down that fence. So what is racial justice? The goal of more equitable opportunities and outcomes is incorporated in the Annie E. Casey Foundation's definition of racism and racial justice. Racism, as you can see here, is defined as not simply personal prejudice, but in fact, it is a complete system of racial hierarchies and inequities. And I want folks to remember that term again, system. And so we're not talking about personal prejudice here of individuals, but we're talking about complex systems in our country that have been created over generations that contribute to racial and social inequity and injustice. So it's a complex system of racial hierarchies and inequities. It's the belief that one racial group is superior to another, and the fact that belief is integrated into the systems of a community, country, or a specific place. Racial justice is a systematic, fair treatment of people of all races that results in equitable opportunities and outcomes for everyone. So all people are able to achieve their full potential in life, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or the community in which they live. So it's all well and good to be reading specific definitions, right? In terms of sort of academic definitions of these terms. But I wanted to just sort of make it a little bit more real for you folks by telling you sort of a personal story about how racism and racial justice has affected me in my life as a biracial woman of color. So start with the story of my parents. So who am I? Where do I come from? Where do my parents come from? My mom is white Irish American from Connecticut, and my dad is a Black Ndebele, was the name of our ethnic group, Zimbabwean, who my parents met in what was then apartheid era Rhodesia, that was the colonial name for Zimbabwe. They met in 1968 when my mom was there teaching at a mission school out, as I say, in the Bundu, or in the rural areas, where my dad had actually, luckily enough, been stationed to do his teacher training. So back in 1968, Rhodesia, however, it was illegal for them to get married there because my mom was white and my dad was Black, or as they refer to in Zimbabwe, colored. That it was actually illegal for them to date even, that they've told me stories about how they were actually followed around by a Rhodesian secret police officer who was assigned to them, who wanted to keep track of their comings and goings, and also their political affiliations. So given that, my dad, long story short, came to the United States in 1972 after they decided they wanted to be married. Once in the US, they married and moved to New England, where my sister and I were born and raised, and where we were the only family of color in our Western Massachusetts town throughout most of my childhood. So that was an interesting childhood, growing up as the only family of color in this small community where everybody knew everybody else. It was a real tight-knit community. That said, there were still many examples of the systemic nature of racism from my life. So here are just a couple. So my little sister, Sarah, who is about 2 years younger than I am, when she started kindergarten at Old Deerfield Elementary School, her kindergarten teacher, who was white, decided to place her in special ed. And my parents, curious about that decision because Sarah had been reading since she was in preschool, being the daughter of 2 teachers, addressed the teacher in terms of asking her about that decision. When the teacher said to my mom at the teacher-parent meeting, in her experience, mixed quote unquote kids were oftentimes struggled with staying in the mainstream classes and that they were quote unquote troubled. So needless to say, my parents had quite a few bones to pick with that, and they insisted that Sarah be put in the mainstream classes. Fast forward a little over 40 years, Sarah has her PhD from Emory University. So take that, kindergarten teacher. The reason I'm telling you that story is just to for you to understand how systemic racism can affect the trajectory of someone's life from an early stage. Another quick example is about 1983. My cousin, Bino, is visiting from Zimbabwe. Bino is much darker than my sister and myself. He is also a teenage boy, has no idea what to get us for Christmas. So he takes us to the local toy store, has us pick out dolls. He has his own money, very proud of that he had earned from a summer job back home. He took us to the register. The white clerk questioned where he got the money, said that she didn't believe that he had earned it himself and that she would not let him purchase the toys for his cousins. My mom had to be called to explain the situation. So again, just talking about giving you real life examples of how systemic racism can and continues to affect people in real life situations. Interesting fact in terms of getting back to the interracial marriage piece, and I think the mixed race identity has really become sort of topical in the past couple of weeks when we have seen the recent results that have come out in the 2020 census. That as a mixed race person myself, was absolutely thrilled to see the increase in representation of people who identify as mixed race. Actually, yesterday I read this really interesting article in the Seattle Times that said that the 2020 census numbers were showing a 272% increase in the number of individuals nationwide who identified as being of one or more races, and so of that mixed race identity. So that's a 272% increase. And there are lots of reasons behind that increase, but again, it's only recently that mixed race identity has really been embraced by many communities. In 1972, when my dad came to be married to my mom in this country, interracial marriage had only been legal in the United States for 5 years, thanks to the Supreme Court case Loving versus State of Virginia. But as of 2000, November of 2000, unfortunately, Alabama still had the fact that they thought that interracial marriage should be illegal in their constitutional books. So thankfully, they voted that out, and now it's legal in all 50 states. But just to give you an idea of the historical aspect and the historical reach of those. So we talk a lot about identity, right? So we talk about my personal mixed race identity. We talk about the importance of social and racial justice focused on those identities. And specifically, social and racial justice focuses on those who have been marginalized and oppressed on the basis of their identities. And their identities go beyond race and ethnicity. They include gender identity, social, economic class, religion, disability, and age as well. And these identities don't act independently from one another, but they can exist simultaneously in what we call intersectionality. And as a result, can compound that inequity that individuals suffer in society. These identities also factor into a caste system, which Isabel Wilkerson's book, entitled Caste, defines as a ranking of human value that presumes the supremacy of one group and the inferiority of another. According to Wilkerson, quote, "In America, race is the primary tool, visible decoy, and frontman for caste. So as such, if you are Black, poor, and disabled, your outcomes are likely to be much worse off than when you are white, poor, and disabled, because racism impacts you disproportionately."
Thank you so much, Elena, for walking us through those important terms. Now, we will take a look at how to incorporate social and racial justice in estate planning. Now, estate planning is very personal and really needs to be tailored to individual situations. Some of you have very young children, while others don't have children at all, or others have very successful children. Some of you have considerable excess wealth, while some of you have enough today, but may lose everything, in the situation of needing long-term care. So this presentation is not about dictating how you should distribute your assets at your death or asking you to disinherit your heirs in favor of BIPOC communities. We're not asking you to totally abandon your longtime philanthropic passions. And we're not espousing or requiring one way to pursue social justice and racial justice in estate planning and plan giving. At the same time, this presentation is not about tokenism. It's not asking you to include optical evidence or performative gestures of racial justice support through perhaps one gift or one hire without truly being committed to and desirous of achieving greater equality. So this presentation is more an invitation to consider how your wealth accumulation was attainable in part because of white privilege or the inequitable application of opportunities and systems. And as a consequence, holding, transferring, and inheriting these unequal economic benefits come with a greater expectation of responsible stewardship and for engaging in justice-oriented actions, including giving, investing, hiring, voting, and advocacy. So I always encourage my clients to reflect on their life story, their values, the sources and uses of their wealth, their family relationships, and their desired legacy before they think about an estate distribution plan. Because your estate plan is really a way of completing the narrative that you have started in your life. The desired outcomes that you have for your wealth, whatever your vision for your wealth is really the continuation of your life story when you're no longer here. So it's good to include in these reflections the sources of your privilege and advantages, and maybe asking yourself some questions about the sources of your privilege. So what is the source of wealth and opportunities during your lifetime, the lifetime of your parents and perhaps your ancestors? Were these same opportunities available to everyone regardless of skin color, ethnicity, or economic class? Did the color of your skin ever cause you to be treated differently? Say, limit the places you can go, limit the person you can date and marry, like Elena's parents, cause you to be discriminated against in jobs or academics, perhaps have very little representation among the teachers that you had or the actors in the movies and the TV shows that you watched, perhaps limit your ability to even use a restroom in a store, or deprive your ancestors from the ability to really rule their lives. So it's important for us not only to talk about the importance of these reflections, but to do the reflections of ourselves. So I will share with you the results of this personal reflection on my life and the life of my ancestors. And I will specifically just focus on three systems that I have benefited from. So I'm the first to tell you that I am not the product of a meritocracy, far from it. So let me start with who I am. I am an immigrant from the Philippines, which used to be a territory of the United States until 1945. My father is a retired doctor and hospital administrator of a government hospital in the northern region of the Philippines. And my mother was a university professor in a university in my hometown, Baguio City. So I just want to start with my father's grandfather first, Manuel Del Prado, who actually hailed from a very small town in Spain, Asturias, Spain. It's called Lorio, and its main source of its economy is actually mining and farming and ranching. And so my great-grandfather actually moved out from Spain and traveled to the Philippines, which was then a colony of Spain, in 1850 to actually really seek a better fortune. And he measured land for the Spanish crown, and also married into a family that was quite affluent. And so he was able to amass land through purchase, through marriage, and probably through royal grant, which was done for administrators at that time. And even though the land has dissipated as he transferred it among his 6 children and 30 grandchildren, and it was also reduced via agrarian reform in the 1960s. 160, 70 years after he acquired those lands, my father is still benefiting from income from the portion of the land that he inherited. And the income that he invested from the land was actually used to help finance my education here in the United States 34 years ago. So let's go to my mother, who is a university professor, and she was able to work in spite of having 5 children. And you probably are wondering, how could she do that? Well, she benefited from the system of household help in the Philippines. And that's a picture of my Manang Lilia, who was my nanny. And then she left to get married and have children, and then came back to serve the family. And she served us for 35 years. And while we treated her as part of the family and helped her and her children over the years, you know, I can't help but think that my mother's ability to pursue her career and the well-being of our family was actually made possible through her sacrifices, you know, and was really built on the back of Manang Lilia and her long separations from her family. And I've been in this country now for 34 years, and I have had 6 jobs in that time. And I can say that I've competitively applied only once for a job. The rest of the jobs I actually got from networking, from being recommended by a previous boss, by being recommended by a friend. So as you can see, I have had, you know, almost like a 170-year head start from the system of colonization. I've benefited from the system of household help, and I've benefited from the system of networking that a lot of communities of color do not have. And that's why I'm really more determined than ever to really help in any way I can to help this divide, and through my estate planning, through my work, and through my actions, really help pay this forward. All right, so I hope you also do an exercise just like this and discover what are the sources of your privilege as a good context before starting your estate plan. So in these pre-estate planning reflections that you'll be conducting, you should also take a look at what privileges did your children have when they were growing up, and how these privileges actually make them, you know, far more advanced in their economic mobility than perhaps their peers. What values do you wish to pass on to them? If you want them to be self-reliant, if you want them to be problem solvers, you know, would it be wise for you to actually give them a lot of resources when they're very young? And then what kind of world do you wish to leave for succeeding generations? You know, it's a world where many are excluded from opportunities, resources, and power acceptable. And then what would you consider the highest purposes of your wealth? I think it's important for you to think about not so much what you give and how much you give, but why you are giving. And what does wealth stewardship mean to you? And how are you going to harness your wealth for really the best positive impact on you, on your children, and the community in which you belong? You should also consider incorporating social and racial justice values in the messages that you write about your legacy. I encourage my clients to write legacy letters or ethical wills. You could also use the term a vision statement for your wealth, or perhaps if you have a trust, whatever is your intention behind the trust, perhaps conveyed in a letter of trust intent, or if you have charitable organizations, then your statement of donor intent and your family meetings. So these are wonderful messages that will be used as a compass for your children when you're no longer here, and will be really a source of inspiration and guidance to them. And in these documents that express your values, you can also include the social and racial justice values that you believe in, whether, here are some examples of this. It's serving the common good, giving priority to the poor and vulnerable, dignity of work and rights of workers, fostering a sense of belonging, and then standing up against racism. So these are all examples of values that you can incorporate in your legacy letters. And you might wonder, I will be known through my actions and my example, but how about your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren? How will they know about these values, and that these are part of their heritage, that this is part really of their identity? Because this is not taught in schools, and as we have seen, it's certainly not exhibited by even individuals who are elected to the highest offices of this country. So it's really important for you to include them in these legacy letters. And then in determining the estate distribution plan, as I mentioned earlier, really think about what would be the ideal purposes served by your bequests to your heirs. So is it for education? Is it perhaps to give them access to high quality healthcare? Is it to enable them perhaps to have home ownership, maybe provide them with an extra cushion in case of an emergency or a catastrophe? But beyond that, what else do they really need? How much is enough to help launch them into productive, resilient, and purposeful lives? And how can you ensure that your heirs really appreciate their Head Start advantage? So if your heirs, for example, have benefited from their tuition already being paid for by you, then they should really appreciate the fact that they are way ahead than 70% of their peers. And are they prepared to responsibly steward their inheritance? I have clients, a couple, who actually decided that they had enough money in their 50s to retire and then spend the rest of their lives actually volunteering in various nonprofits in the Kent and the Auburn area. So they do direct service. They also serve on the boards of various nonprofit organizations that take care of marginalized populations. And so they came to me and asked for my guidance in creating a values-based estate plan. And they decided, after looking at the sources of their privilege, looking at also the privileges of their children, and most of their children ended up being engineers and are very self-reliant. And so they decided to actually leave 50% of their estate to their children and 50% to nonprofit organizations that they care about that serve marginalized people of color. And so they invited me to attend their family meeting and asked, how do we start that family meeting where we do this big reveal? And I encouraged them to actually read portions of their legacy letter, the main messages of why they are doing this. What are the values that they care about, that they hope to transfer to their heirs? So as they were reading, it was just very touching, and their children also crying. Everyone was crying because it was just so heartwarming to be reminded of how much they were loved, and what values truly inform their actions, and that they hope that their heirs would carry out into the future. And when their children actually learned about the estate plan, they thought that that was perfect, and that really was most reflective or expressive of the parents that they knew. And that the old estate plan that left everything to them was really not reflective of the parents that they knew. So we highly encourage you to communicate to your heirs about these values. So in determining your estate distribution plan, you might also think about dedicating a portion of your estate to fostering public good, incorporating charitable organizations in your estate plan. So this can be done various ways. So you could add specific bequests to charitable organizations, including organizations that are racial justice causes. You can perhaps dedicate a percentage of your estate or the residue of your estate to charitable organizations that, again, serve social and racial justice causes. Elena and I are board members of this organization called Leave 10, where we're encouraging as many individuals to aspire to leave at least 10% of their estate to charitable organizations. You could also have the option for your heirs to disclaim a portion of their inheritance to go to the estate residue. And the estate residue then will be dedicated to charitable organizations. And in this way, there will be more of your estate that will go to those organizations, and your heirs feel as though they participated in this. Your heirs could also use a portion of their inheritance to make gifts to charity. So they can turn around and make gifts to charitable organizations and benefit from an income tax deduction by doing that. And there are all kinds of strategies out there, some very simple, like including charities as the beneficiary of your retirement plans or life insurance plans, or some more complex, where you have perhaps the income interest going to charity, the remainder interest of a trust going to your heirs, or the reverse of that, the income interest going to your heirs and the remainder interest going to charitable organizations. So something to talk to your plan giving officers at the organizations that you care about, as well as your advisors. And then lastly, in determining the estate distribution plan, I think it would be important for you to reflect on, are you the true owner of your assets, or are you just a temporary steward? There are some faith-based traditions that echo this notion of stewardship and encourage tithing as an expression, say, of the stewardship of God's gifts. And there are also some indigenous tribes, particularly the Lakotas, that consider material wealth as really a community resource intended to care for tribal people and to provide a strong foundation for future generations. And then finally, how do you feel about deploying a portion of your wealth for reparation? You know, really helping heal the harm inflicted on BIPOC communities for centuries. Perhaps you can think about leaving a percentage of all your charitable, the aspects of your plan, whether it's 25% or 50% dedicated to this purpose, perhaps focused on organizations that are helping with wealth building, economic mobility mechanisms for BIPOC communities, for helping them provide home ownership, seed money for businesses, mentorship and navigation programs for greater academic success. So this will be part of what Edgar Villanueva called decolonizing wealth. Now I will pass it on to Elena, who will be talking about how you choose the charities with a social and racial justice framework.
Great. Thanks so much, Lorraine. So in terms of some of the questions that, so we know all this information and have decided, yes, indeed, I feel it's important in terms of my estate plan, in terms of my legacy, to really prioritize social justice, racial justice in my estate plan. But now what? And in my work at the Community Foundation of Snohomish County, I work primarily with estate planning attorneys, financial advisors, and accountants who are working with clients who are wondering about what their estate plan is going to look like. And the question that I get on a regular basis from these professional advisors is, yes, my clients have this commitment, but now what? What do I say to them in terms of they know the why, they know why they want to create this kind of legacy, but how can they actually do it? What are the action steps? And so here are just a few examples of kind of that how, that kind of now what to do in terms of actionable items you can take with your estate plan. So if you wish to include charities in your estate plan with a social and racial justice within that framework, consider including charities that, first of all, are focused or have programs focused on providing services to communities experiencing disparities and inequities due to race, gender identity, disability, and other historic causes of discrimination. Specifically, look at organizations that are accountable to the communities being served. And so they're not just talking the talk about social justice, racial justice, but they're actually walking the walk in terms of the community engagement that they are showing every day. You want to make sure organizations are led and guided from people from those communities being served and are lifting up voices and grooming future leaders from communities of color, specifically Black, Indigenous, Latino, Asian, and other people of color. Also give special attention to Black-led organizations which have historically received less than 2% of foundation grants. So Black-led organizations, I have to repeat that because it's a really important point. Black-led organizations nationwide have historically received less than 2% of foundation grants. And yet these organizations are often the ones on the front lines of social change. Other considerations include striving to address the root causes of economic, racial, and social injustices, and organizations that have on-the-ground expertise on these issues. Also, look for organizations that endeavor to align their investment of their charitable dollars with their mission to address this inequality. So when you look at the type of charitable contribution that you are providing to these organizations, consider charitable contributions that are, first of all, flexible and unrestricted. So one of the key, in terms of when we look at the types of donations that have the most impact, that they are donations that trust the organization. They trust the knowledge, they trust the professionalism, they trust the on-the-ground expertise of the staff and the board of these specific organizations to use the money as it's needed. And so providing, from a donor's perspective, providing that flexible and unrestricted donation to help these organizations fund the areas that they know that they will best be used and will provide the greatest impact is really key. Also, providing support immediately or over a 3 to 5 year period is really important in terms of that impact, as opposed to providing endowment trickles over a longer period of time. For supporting Black-led, quote unquote, social change infrastructure, it's really important, again, to think, again, getting back to that word system, right? Getting back to that, how do we address the systemic nature of social and racial injustice? Look for organizations that are really addressing those social change, that infrastructure. Things such as they're supporting leadership development, community organizing, and the building of Black and other people of color communities' economic power. There are many examples of charities that are focused on the long-term, quote unquote, social change infrastructure. I'm sure you're familiar with a number of them on a national level. In terms of Black empowerment, we have the NAACP, we have historically Black colleges and universities, the Black Lives Matter movement. Local, there are also a lot of really interesting organizations and really powerful organizations that are providing local change. just a few that the Community Foundation of Snohomish County is working with and has really seen the on-the-ground impact that these organizations have. Project Girl in Linwood, Communities of Color Coalition in the Everett area and throughout Snohomish County. The Black Futures Co-op Fund is an amazing group that is actually housed at the Seattle Foundation, but is doing really interesting work in terms of that, addressing that systemic racism. The Columbia Legal Services and Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, there are so many. Too, if you're looking for more resources and more examples, community foundations, your local community foundation is a great resource. So the Community Foundation of Snohomish County, we continue to work with organizations and community groups, such as the Black Futures Co-op Fund, Communities of Color Coalition, the Snohomish County NAACP, to raise awareness of Black-led nonprofits and nonprofits focused on communities of color, specifically in Snohomish County. So just to reiterate, so Community Foundation of Snohomish County, but there, as we all know, there are some wonderful community foundations throughout the state, throughout the region, who really have a lot of valuable insight into what's going on the ground. Also consider donating to organizations that are primarily involved in legislative action. Political action is key in terms of growing that impact, in terms of addressing the systemic nature of past injustices and current injustices as well. They're powerful enablers of system change, and they really amplify the impact of your donation through the government programs they seek to change. Since most estates will not be subject to estate tax, the absence of charitable tax deductions for contributions to these political-based organizations will not really be a disadvantage to many folks. So that's something to consider as well. And also be proximate to your donations. Be proximate to the organizations you're supporting. Visit Black communities and Black-led organizations to create a deeper understanding of your experience, of their experiences and their needs. Again, learning from the community, learning from the people who are on the ground doing the work. Author Brian Stevenson said, quote, "We cannot create justice without getting close to places where injustices prevail. We have to get proximate." And lastly, don't ignore the small, scrappy organizations led by Black, Indigenous, Latino, Asian, and other people of color. These are fiscally sponsored sometimes, but are doing effective community-based efforts to address inequities. Their systemic exclusion from traditional social, economic, and political resources have a lot to do with why many Black-led organizations are not independent 501c3s, but instead are benefiting from the 501c3 status of other larger nonprofit organizations. And lastly, be humble, but do tell the story behind your giving priorities to your peers. They may be inspired by your example. Here are some more resources that Lorraine and I have put together. And by no means is this an exhaustive list, but it's a place to get started. Do your own research, find the resources and ask for help if you need it. And really be thinking all along back to the question of what kind of legacy do you want to leave?
Great. Now we'll move on to how you might incorporate the social and racial justice lens in your investments. Now, Elena and I are not investment professionals, but we asked our friends at Fulcrum Capital in Seattle, who do values-based investing, specifically with a social justice lens for some of their foundation clients. And here are some of their general recommendations. At first, they talked to us about the challenges and opportunities in doing this because it's a relatively new area. So there are very few consistent definitions, metrics, not really very high quality data, inadequate measuring tools, and incomplete disclosures for a lot of these funds. But also this is a period for opportunity, because if a lot more investors demand more portfolios that are constructed with these values, then there'll be better access to investment vehicles, and there'll be also broader adoption of these practices and improvements in disclosures, and greater recognition of these portfolios' financial return potential. So here are some tactics that they shared with us. So divest investments in businesses that negatively impact marginalized communities. So think about private prisons, predatory lending companies, guns, pipelines in indigenous land. So some financial institutions that are actually investing in these, or in immigrant detention. And then invest in funds, companies, and programs that drive positive social outcomes. So you have some examples of funds like Calvert, Domini, and Parnassus that really incorporate an ESG lens, that's environment, sustainability, and governance in the choice of companies that are included in their funds. Or you can ask your advisors to do really deep qualitative analysis on specific companies. Maybe using some screening tools like Sustainalytics, MSCI, Equilo, Equileap, and then also just asking questions, from their human resources department about the equity in their hiring practices. You could also incorporate a social and racial justice lens in policies and practices. So first, you should engage in advocacy through proxy voting and activism, and demand to have more diverse boards in those companies that you're invested in. They are recommending 33% of women and people of color. I'd say drive for 50% women on their boards and people of color on their boards. Demand pay practices that reduce inequality, equitable hiring and promotion practices. And in fact, diversity actually contributes to better run businesses and contributes to better investment results. So whether that's more profitable companies, lower volatility, lower cost of capital, and less debt. In fact, the McKinsey company had a study in 2018, and their conclusion was companies with more culturally and ethnically diverse executive teams were 33% more likely to see better than average profits. And at the board of directors level, more ethnically and culturally diverse companies were 43% more likely to see above average profits. Now let's get into hiring. Elena?
Great. Thanks so much, Lorraine. So let's not forget applying a social and racial justice lens and an engagement of the estate planning professionals that we're looking at. There are many firms and industry associations that can help in this search. Just to give you an example, I'm involved with the Association of African American Financial Advisors. I used to be co-chair of their Advancing Leadership Committee. And one thing we do is to promote advisors of color. If you go to their website, you can actually search by region. I've made some of my greatest contacts in terms of the community foundations work with financial advisors in this neck of the woods through the Association of African American Financial Advisors, steering me in the right direction and listing members locally. Also, in terms of accountants, the National Association of Black Accountants, the Seattle chapter is very well represented. The National Conference on Black Lawyers, also called the National Black Lawyers Association. Also, some national firms have stated and demonstrated commitment to advancing diversity and racial equity, in particular LPL Financial, US Bank, Raymond James. That one group actually that I have a recent experience with is working with Edward Jones. That I had a wonderful conversation with a group of financial advisors in the Linwood area, so southern Snohomish County, if you want to call it that. And they are a group of, it's called their Diverse Advisors Network. And so they are actively, it's an example of a very large national firm that is actively looking to recruit diverse population of advisors, especially as many of the baby boomer financial advisors are starting to retire. That in terms of kind of replacing that traditional profession that traditionally has been overwhelmingly white and male with more women and more people of color in their ranks. So again, there are a lot of firms that if you start asking, and again, as Lorraine said, the key is to start asking, that professionals need to know that their clients are looking, that these topics of diversity is important to us. And so keep asking those questions.
Thanks, Elena. All right, we've gone through a lot of ideas and concepts in the past 15 minutes. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we'll be making available handouts that enumerate the many ways that you can incorporate a social and racial justice lens in your estate planning. So we hope you found this webinar useful in starting an important conversation. It's really important for you to look at this as a journey. You can't accomplish this immediately. It's difficult, and you cannot do this quickly or perfectly. We encourage you to take small steps first, but really start with your own self-reflection and just choose to implement the parts that resonate most with you now. And consult with your like-minded friends, perhaps like have a study group and exchange ideas, have a buddy, and the two of you be in the same journey for your personal reckoning and how you apply these values to your lives and your practices. Write a personal statement about your own beliefs and values regarding social and racial justice and how you wish to incorporate this in your life and your estate plan. There's something very, very powerful about a written statement. And then lastly, discuss what you plan to do with your family, because it's a very, very important topic. And that way, all of you learn together and all of you are part of this healing journey. So thank you again for listening to us today, and we hope you found this webinar helpful. We would now like to open the floor to questions, and I think either Cara or Cindy
yes,
will
I'm here. Yes,
facilitate.
thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, Elena. That was a fantastic presentation, and we do have some questions. We're really short on time, so we're going to try to get through as many as we can. Marianne asks, why encourage us to just focus on Black-led organizations? Latina women and Native American women earn less than Black women. I think we should try to help all groups who are earning less than whites.
I completely agree.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I might debate the stat that Latina women necessarily earn less than Black women, but I think it's not but it's not a competition, right? Right? It's you know, when in terms of looking at what really speaks to you as a donor and as someone looking to leave a legacy, that perhaps supporting Latinx organizations speaks to you, speaks to your family history more than supporting Black-led organization, and that's fine. That the important thing is really looking to support marginalized communities. And unfortunately, there are many marginalized communities. But fortunately, there are many marginalized communities that are doing amazing, impactful work to support many different communities of color. So I encourage you to reach out to whichever community really speaks to you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. We have a question here asking Elena if you can share again the nonprofits locally that you had started to list and appreciate. You started with Project Girl, and I'd like to take the opportunity too to just say that both of our library foundations have a commitment to supporting library programs with a direct equity commitment. I know ours, we just recently did an audit and we're close to 80% of the programs we support. And I know Cindy's organization is up there too. So think about your libraries when you're thinking about this. But Elena, were there other ones you had in mind just that you could rattle off quickly?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. So Project Girl is doing some really, interesting, and again, it kind of depends what your passion is. If it is girls' education, a group like Project Girl would be fantastic. But I know as a mom that girls' education and just education in general, especially with all the remote learning that was happening in the past year and a half, has really come to the forefront of my mind of lack of access, really, that so many communities have. That one recommendation that I would have is, so I'm just using the Community Foundation of Snohomish County as an example, just because that's the one I know best.
Sure.
Is you go to our website, which is www.cf-sc.org, and it's basically, you can see my email there, so you can figure out what our website is. If you look, so we were fortunate enough to partner with Snohomish County starting in March of 2020 and going forward to current day to help distribute the CARES money that was coming from the national government or the federal government in terms of supporting nonprofits. So our priority at our community foundation was to use that CARES money, again, in partnership with Snohomish County, to support nonprofit organizations that, number one, were benefiting marginalized communities, specifically communities of colors and immigrant communities in Snohomish County. And secondly, were led by people of color as well. And so we actually have a list of the nonprofits that received those CARES grants on our website. And so again, that's Snohomish County. But if you look that there's for specific names, there are not only a list of the organization, but I believe we also have a short description of what the grant was for. So that is kind of a starting point in terms of local nonprofits.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're out of time. I want to have my sincere thanks to both Elena and Lorraine for taking time out of their really busy schedules to share information and ideas with all of you. I hope you found it valuable. And a reminder, as soon as this webinar ends, you'll be prompted to take a quick survey. Filling this out will not only help us, but it will enter you into a drawing to win a great prize for any library fan, a bag filled with books. In addition, Kara and I will be sending a follow-up email with a recording and additional information, so look for that soon. Please know that a charitable bequest is one of the most meaningful ways you can support the nonprofits you love, including the library. If you have any other questions or would like to continue this conversation, please reach out to either me or Kara. Our contact information will be in the follow-up emails. And finally, thank you all for coming today and take care.
Thank you.